Hello, my name is Samantha, and today I will be talking to you about the writing section of the IELTS test. To begin with the structure and timing, the writing section of the IELTS test has 2 tasks, and you have a total of 60 minutes to complete the entire section. We're going to be talking mainly about task 1 today. So task 1 asks you to describe some visual information in your own words. So this part should take 20 minutes and you should be writing 150 words. For scoring, for both of the tasks on the writing section, these are the 4 criteria that everything is based on. So they are task achievement, coherence and cohesion, lexical resource, and grammatical range and accuracy. And we'll talk in more detail about all of those. So before we get into the scoring, just to be sure that you know the type of question that you will see on this section of the test. This is one example that is quite a typical example. So the question asks you or tells you that you will be spending 20 minutes on this task, and then it asks the following question. It says, the chart below shows the number of men and women in further education in Britain in 3 periods and whether they were studying full-time or part-time. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features, and make comparisons where relevant. And you should write at least 150 words. And then you have a bar chart below that you will be looking at when you're presenting this information. So this is the data that you have to be able to tell them about this issue. So you'll be looking at the chart and seeing the numbers for full-time and part-time, looking for the main points that you see and any big differences that you see, and summarizing. And we'll go into more examples as we get further into the video. But for now, I want to talk about scoring. So the scoring system is a score from 0 to 9. 9 is the top score that you can get for each section. And I want to talk to you about what that perfect answer, perfect score would be like. So if you wanted to get a perfect score in this section for this task, then you would have to fully satisfy all of the requirements of the task and clearly present a fully developed response. So to get that score of 9, that perfect score, you have to really fully answer all of the requirements that are listed in the task, and you have to be clear and give a very fully developed response. For a score of 8, you would still be covering all of the requirements of the task, but they say sufficiently. So not fully, but sufficiently. It's enough. Then it presents, highlights, and illustrates key features, bullet points clearly and appropriately. So you're still covering the task, you're being clear, you're being appropriate. Still a really great score, but you could have done just a little bit more. For a score of 7, you would be covering the requirements of the task, but they don't say fully, but you are covering them. Then presents a clear overview of main trends, differences, or stages. So you do have that overview. And then clearly presents and highlights key features or bullet points, but could be more fully extended. So you're covering everything somewhat adequately, but you could be doing everything more clearly and more fully. A score of 6. It says, addresses the requirements of the task, presents an overview with information appropriately selected, and presents and adequately highlights key features or bullet points, but details may be irrelevant, inappropriate, or inaccurate. So if you're making some mistakes, if you're reporting something that is inaccurate or irrelevant to the point that you're trying to make, then that's where you might see a score of 6. So you have to be careful to be giving correct information and making sure that everything you tell them is relevant to what you're saying. Band 5, says generally addresses the task, but the format might be inappropriate in places. Then you're recounting detail mechanically with no clear overview. There may be no data to support the description. And I think I'll probably say data sometimes and data sometimes in this video. Both are acceptable pronunciations of the word. I don't know why I switch between them, but it's not regional and it's just a word that you can say either way. So just in case that confuses you about the pronunciation of the word, I wanted to explain. So if you're giving details mechanically, you are just stating them. You're not telling a story with it. You're just saying there were 100 people who did this. There were 20 people who did this. There were 3 people who did this. That's just telling the facts. You're not saying, for example, there was a very high participation from this group where there were 100 people doing this compared to this group, which only had 20 people participating, just as an example. So you have to connect those and put them in as thoughts that are developed instead of only saying the pieces of information and the numbers from the chart. And alternatively, you might be giving your information, your sentences about the data, but without actually giving any numbers. Presents but inadequately covers key features or bullet points, and there may be a tendency to focus on detail. So again, you might be focusing too much on detail and just reading all of the numbers. That wouldn't be sufficient. A score of 4, your format might be inappropriate. You're trying to address the task, but you're not covering everything, or you may confuse some features. Parts may be unclear, irrelevant, repetitive, or inaccurate. A score of 3, you would be failing to address the task, which may have been completely misunderstood. So if you completely misunderstood the question, then there's a chance you might get a score of 3. Or if you present limited ideas which are largely irrelevant or repetitive, then you could also get a score of 3. So if you're just saying lots of numbers that aren't relevant to the ideas that you're trying to convey, or if you are just repeating a lot of information, then you might get a score of 3. And for a score of 2, the answer is barely related to the task. And for a score of 1, the answer is completely unrelated to the task. Sorry about that division of that sentence. So you are answering it, but you're trying to answer it, but it's actually not related at all. So I doubt that you will get a score of 1 on the test. And then for a 0, you would have to not attend or not give an answer or write a totally memorized response, which seems fairly impossible to do because you don't know what the question will be, but you're using memorized sentences and you're not answering the question. So to improve your score for this section, you should be doing some of the following things. So you should make sure that you understand and answer the question. Be careful not to get distracted by just summarizing or just focusing on one aspect of it. Make sure you're looking at the question, you know what the question asks, and you're answering that question. So a lot of them do ask you to summarize, but don't just assume that they're only asking you to summarize. You're going to have to look and see what points they might ask you to stress. You should analyze the chart and find the most important information to discuss. So you have to take a minute to look at the chart and see what is it showing you. Is there anything really obvious? Are there some really dramatic differences between some of the numbers? Is it trying to show you an increase in the numbers? Are you seeing a very big decrease in the numbers? You just want to look at those things first and see what you would like to focus on. You need to provide an overview of the key information. So that's always a key point, is to make sure you're giving a little bit of an overview. You need to always support your points with data. So you can't only use words and never refer to the actual numbers in the chart, but you also can't only use numbers and list them. So you have to have a good balance of writing and using the facts from the data to support what you're writing. Stick to the facts when writing your essay. So you don't need to insert your opinion. You don't need to make a lot of theories. You're just summarizing and presenting the information to them in a written form. And you have to write at least 150 words. And we'll talk a little bit about that later as well. Okay, moving on to the next criteria. It is coherence and cohesion. So for a perfect score on this section, you would have to use cohesion in such a way that it attracts no attention. So you're doing things so naturally that the reader doesn't think, oh, they're trying to be very cohesive. So you need to sound very natural. And then skillfully manages paragraphing. So you are using your different paragraphs easily, clearly, in an appropriate way without any issues. For a score of 8, it says sequences information and ideas logically, manages all aspects of cohesion well, and uses paragraphing sufficiently and appropriately. So you're being logical and cohesive, and your paragraphs are appropriate and they are sufficient, but it's just not that extra level of excellence for the score of 9. For a score of 7, you would have to logically organize information and ideas, and there would have to be a clear progression throughout your answer. And then uses a range of cohesive devices appropriately, but there may be some under or overuse. So it may look like you're really trying to use cohesive devices instead of naturally using them, but you are using them. For a score of 6, it says arranges information and ideas coherently, and there's a clear overall progression. So you're still being clear and logical and coherent. Uses cohesive devices effectively, but cohesion within and or between sentences may be faulty or mechanical. So it won't sound very natural when you're using these devices. And may not always use referencing clearly or appropriately. A score of 5 would mean that you present your information with some organization, but there's a lack of progression. So it's organized, but they're not really seeing you move from the beginning of your essay to the end of your essay in a clear and logical way. Another thing for a score of 5 would be making inadequate, inaccurate, or overusing cohesive devices. So it's inaccurate, it's not enough, or it's too much. And then maybe repetitive because of a lack of referencing and substitution. So you don't want to sound like you're repeating information. There is a lot of information in these charts for you to write 150 words about it. So you don't need to say the same facts multiple times. For a score of 4, you would be presenting information and ideas, but they're not arranged coherently and there's no clear progression. So you're giving ideas, but it's not in a logical way. You're not starting with an overview and then giving some information and then concluding. It's all over the place. Or maybe you're talking about something being really high and then talking about something completely unrelated to that. And then later you talk about something related to that that was really low, but you're not linking these things. You're not making a clear comparison. You're just throwing things together, basically. Uses some basic cohesive devices, but they may be inaccurate or repetitive. So you are using cohesive devices, but not very well. For a score of 3, Your ideas are not arranged logically, and you are very limited in your cohesive devices usage. And they're not actually showing a logical relationship between ideas. For a score of 2, you would have very little control of organizational features. So you're not really understanding how to organize your work and present it clearly. And for number 1, fails to communicate any message. So you're maybe putting some random facts, but you're not communicating anything that is of value to the reader. Score of 0, you did not attend, or you didn't attempt the task, or you wrote a completely memorized response once again. So to improve your score in this section for coherence and cohesion, you need to be sure to plan how to organize and present your information. So the first thing you should be doing after you look at the chart and understand the chart would be to make a short plan of what information you want to present, and just make sure that you're doing it in a logical way so that you're not jumping all around. Take a moment to think, okay, I want to say this and compare these two things, and then this. Just plan out something that seems logical. Make sure that you are clear and that your writing is easy to understand. So you don't try to get overly complicated with your sentences because you're trying to show that it's complex, and then make it really difficult to understand. So you don't have to have incredibly long sentences. And we'll talk a little bit more about the types of words and phrases you can use to be clear, but don't get carried away with it. You need to be easy to understand. And then use a variety of linking devices correctly. So you should be linking your ideas. Not all of your sentences will be just, it was 9, this was 10. You're not giving information like that. You're going to be writing in sentences that are a little more complex. And we'll get into those things a little more afterwards. Okay, for lexical resource, the next section. For a score of 9, you would have to be using a very wide range of vocabulary, very naturally, in a sophisticated way. And it mentions that this is rare. So this basically would be a very well-spoken native speaker could do this easily, but it is a hard one to attain for non-native speakers. You may have minor errors, but they are only slips. It's not showing that you lack an understanding of the vocabulary. It's just a mistake. For a score of 8, you would need to use a wide range of vocabulary fluently and flexibly to convey precise meanings. So you have a wide range, you're using them very well. You are skillfully using uncommon lexical items, but there may be occasional inaccuracies in word choice and collocation. So you're using some uncommon words or phrases, but it might not be 100% perfect and natural, which is to be expected and fine, but it's still a really high level of English that's being used here. And produces rare errors in spelling and or word formation. So you can have mistakes, but they should be rare. For a score of 7, you would be using a sufficient range of vocabulary to allow some flexibility and precision. So you're using enough vocabulary, but it's not an incredibly impressive range of vocabulary. You're using some less common lexical items with some awareness of the style and collocation. So you're using some uncommon words or phrases, and you have some awareness of how to use them, but it's not perfectly used. And you may have some occasional errors. For a score of 6, you would be using an adequate range of vocabulary for the task. So it is enough. Again, it's not incredibly impressive at this point. You are attempting to use some less common vocabulary, but it is sometimes inaccurate. and you're making some errors, but they do not impede communication. So even though you're making mistakes, you can be understood. A score of 5, you have a limited range of vocabulary, but it is minimally adequate for the task. So it is enough for you to communicate your ideas, but it's not a very wide range. And then you might be making some noticeable mistakes in spelling or word formation, and it might be a little bit confusing to the reader. For a score of 4, you would be using only basic vocabulary, and it might be repetitive or it might be inappropriate. So you do not have such a wide range of vocabulary that you can use for this task. And you have a limited control of word formation or spelling, and errors might make things confusing for the reader. For a score of 3, you're using a very limited range of words and expressions with very limited control. And your errors may severely distort the message, so your mistakes could be very confusing to the reader, and you might not be able to show your ideas. For a score of 2, you would be extremely limited in your range of vocabulary. You have no control of word formation or spelling. And a score of 1, you can just use a few isolated words, so you're not really able to communicate your ideas. And of course, for a score of 0, you would have to not attend, not attempt the task, or write a completely memorized response. So some suggestions to improve your score for task 1 for the lexical resource would be to use a range of vocabulary, ideally a wide range of vocabulary, and you have to use it accurately, and you should not be repetitive. So you want to be using words and phrases that are not incredibly common. Sometimes you don't have to use very strange words throughout, but you should be comfortable with a lot of words so that you can convey your ideas in an interesting way and show that you know a lot of words. Again, it shouldn't be unnatural. You shouldn't be throwing in really strange or unrelated words, of course, but you're showing that you can talk about this topic very easily and that you have all of the necessary words and phrases to be able to do that. And don't be repeating the same words all the time. So we will talk a little bit about some useful vocabulary. So when you're describing data, it can get repetitive sometimes. There are a lot of things that you might want to say many times. So instead of always saying under, for example, the information you're looking at is lower than something. So you can use words like lower than, below, less than, just under, well under, slightly under, nearly, almost, close to, considerably less than, or far less than. So a lot of my students ask me for words and phrases and sentences that they can memorize for the IELTS test. This is an example of some words that you can memorize. Memorization is tricky. It should be a part of your learning, not a part of preparing for specific questions on tests. You can't memorize sentences to use in a test, but you can memorize words that are often appearing in these tests. So describing data is a very specific thing. You should be prepared to talk about it and know that you'll be talking about things that are higher or lower or equal to or the same as, and you can look at phrases that mean the same things so that you're not always saying the same word over and over. So don't always say under. If you're saying under and you notice you said it 2 or 3 times, you can change that. Change it to below or less than. If it's a lot under, you can say well under. If it's just a little bit under, you can say just under or slightly under. Or you can say it's nearly something. Rather than saying under 10, you can say it's nearly 10, almost 10, close to 10. Considerably less than is a lot less. or far less is also a lot less. So think about these phrases. You can use a lot of vocabulary like this when you are describing charts. Approximately is a word you might want to use often. You can say it is about, it is around, or it is approximately. Those are 3 ways to say that instead of choosing. Some people would always say about or around, or they would always say approximately, rather than saying the same word 2 or 3 or 4 times. Try to vary it a little. For describing data that is over a certain amount, you can say words like above, more than, just over, or slightly over, marginally above, well over if it's a lot higher, considerably more than, also higher than. So these are some ways that you can say over, even if you're saying the word over multiple times. Don't just say over. Say if it's a little bit over or a lot over using some of these phrases. And that can make it seem less repetitive, and it's showing that you have a better range of vocabulary. For describing an upward trend, you can say that there was a rise. You can use to rise, say that it is rising. And so even if it's that one word rise, you have options. You can use it as a noun or as a verb. You can say that it is happening now, or it rose. There are different choices for using even the same word. You can say increase, or there was an increase, or it was increasing, it increased. Climb, a climb, climbing. Grow, a growth, growing. Go up, going up. Jump, if it happened quickly. You can say there was a jump in the numbers, or jumping. And then rocket, that one is, it doesn't sound like something you should use often. Actually, that's only if it's really steeply increasing. So if you're watching a chart and instead of it going up slowly, like this, it's actually just suddenly almost vertical, then you can say rocket, but don't use it often because it's a very dramatic word. If there's a downward trend, you can use words like decrease, drop, fall, decline, go down, plummet, or plunge. So again, plummeting and plunging are more dramatic words like rocket. So it's going down very quickly. So you don't want to use this a lot. You can use words like drop or fall or decrease a little more often, but don't say plummet multiple times in one question. I would recommend that unless it was a lot of things were plummeting, then it doesn't seem as dramatic. But I think that only if you notice one really dramatic change, you can say to plummet or to plunge. They have a very similar meaning. If your trend is stable in your chart, then you can say stay, remain, maintain, stable, steady, or unchanged. Those are some words. So you can say it stayed at around this number, or it remained around this level, it maintained this level, it was stable, it was steady, or it was unchanged. Those are some ways to describe something that didn't change for a while. Some other words you might want to use when you're describing charts would be fluctuating, a dip, so a small decrease, not plummeting, but still it could be significant amount of a decrease. To remain steady, remain stable, remain unchanged. To level off, so it's going higher and then it's remaining a little flatter. Peak, reach a peak of, or hit a high of, hit a low of, or bottom out. Plateau is when it becomes flatter if you're looking at a trend. So those are some words that you can add into your vocabulary so that you're prepared to talk about charts. Some adverbs. So you can use a lot of adverbs when you're describing charts. You can say something is happening steadily, gradually, slightly, sharply, rapidly, steeply, dramatically, considerably, significantly. And then as an adjective, it would be steady or gradual, slight, sharp, rapid, steep, dramatic, considerable, or significant. So these are some words that maybe in your general conversation with people you don't use so often, but because you know that you have to describe charts for this test, you can add that into your vocabulary to make sure that you have a variety of words to describe these things. You could also be talking about time periods. So you can say over the period of 10 years or 5 days. It might be days or hours or minutes or years or decades. You don't know what the information will be. Over the next 3 days, so you could be talking about something and then saying over the following 3 days or the next 3 days. 3 days later, I'm using days a lot here, but of course it could be minutes or hours or years. In the following 3 days, the next 3 days show from Monday to Friday, between this time and this time, between this year and this year, things like that. So the last year or the final year, the first year, and then at the beginning or at the end of the period. So lots of different ways to talk about different times instead of just saying in 1990. You can use that too, but when you're talking about a range, you can say from 1990 to the year 2000. You can use some different phrasing. Some more adverbs: quickly, sharply, rapidly. I think we covered some of these. Significantly, substantially, considerably is a lot, or gradually, moderately, are slower. Steadily is another word we could use, slightly and slowly. So these are some words that come in handy. So nouns: a decline, a decrease, a fall, a dip, a drop, an increase, a growth, a rise, a peak, the highest point, or a variation. A lot of these words you can use it as a noun or as a verb. It can be used in a variety of ways. Okay, so now we're going to talk about grammatical range and accuracy. So when we are looking at this criteria, if you want to have a perfect score, then band 9 score says uses a wide range of structures with full flexibility and accuracy. Rare minor errors occur only as slips. So you're using a complete wide range of structures and you're doing it perfectly. For a score of 8, you would be using a wide range of structures and the majority of your sentences are error-free, and you make only very occasional errors or inappropriacies. So you're doing a great range, you're using a wide range of grammatical structures, you're making almost no mistakes. There's still room for some mistakes, but they have to be rare. For band 7, you would be using a variety of structures, complex structures, and you usually or frequently have error-free sentences, but not always. And you have a good control of grammar and punctuation, but you're making some mistakes, a few. For band 6, you would be using a mix of simple and complex sentence forms. So your sentences are sometimes very simple, but you do sometimes have complex ones, and you're making some mistakes in grammar and punctuation, but they don't reduce the ability of the reader to understand you. For band 5, you're using a limited range of structures. You're trying complex sentences, but they're not very accurate compared to your simple sentences. And you might make frequent grammatical errors, or your punctuation may be incorrect, and this can start to cause some difficulty for the reader. So you're starting to confuse them with the mistakes that you're making. For band 4, you're using a very limited range of structures. You're not using subordinate clauses very often at all. and you are sometimes accurate, but you have a lot of mistakes and your punctuation is often wrong. Score of 3 would be attempting sentence forms, but you're making a lot of mistakes that are making it very hard to understand you, and it's changing the meaning of your sentences. Score of 2 would be cannot use sentence forms except in memorized phrases. So you're only using memorized phrases. Number 1, you can't use sentences at all. And again, score of 0 would mean that you didn't attend, you didn't attempt the task, or you're only using some memorized sentences or phrases. Okay, so now we're moving into some more examples. So I want you to see some more examples of what types of questions can be found on this test. So pie charts, it says pie charts. I know you don't see a pie chart, but I wanted to make it clear to view. So I've broken it into 2 slides. So this is a sample. From the IELTS test, it says you should spend 20 minutes on this task. And then the question is, the pie chart shows the amount of money that a children's charity located in the USA spent and received in 1 year, 2016. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. So you'll notice that the phrasing of the question is very similar to the phrasing of the question we saw earlier. It gives you a little summary of what the chart is about, and then it says summarize it, talk about the main features, and make some comparisons where relevant. So the question is almost identical. So this is the set of pie charts. So the title gives you more information: revenue sources and expenditures of a USA charity in 1 year, 2016, similar to what they said in the question. So you have one chart for revenue sources and one for expenditures, and it breaks it down into different pieces. So you can see that donated food was 86.6% of the revenue source. Community contributions were 10.4%. Program revenue was 2.2%. Investment income was 0.2%. And then they have other income 0.4% and government grants 0.2%. And it gives you the total number as well. So just over 53.5 million. And then expenditures, you can see it's broken down into fewer categories. So they have program services, 95.8%, fundraising, 2.6%, and management in general, 1.6%. And it comes to over $53 million. So you will be looking at these charts. You want to see what are the most important points. Obviously, you have to talk about the parts of the chart that are the biggest. You have to mention donated food. You can't forget to mention donated food because it is nearly 90% of what their revenue comes from. So you will be talking about where the majority of their revenue comes from and then what make up the smaller pieces. And then the expenditures. So what do they spend their money on? Of course, you have to talk a lot about program services because that's their main thing. And then you will mention the smaller amounts as well. I said talk a lot about it. You don't have to talk a lot about it actually, but you have to mention it because it is the biggest piece of the chart. So you will be summarizing that information. Another example would be, this is going to be a table, but the question says you should spend about 20 minutes on this task. The table shows the proportions of pupils attending 4 secondary school types between 2000 and 2009. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. Write at least 150 words. So again, the question is almost identical to the previous questions. So then this is the table. Secondary school attendance, you have specialist schools and the percentages for each year, grammar schools, voluntary controlled schools, and community schools. So you'll just take a minute to look at this, see where the biggest numbers are, the smallest numbers, try to take note of, like you could talk about what was highest in 2000 And then if that changed in 2005, or the highest was still the highest, but they were changing, and then in 2009, suddenly the one that was the highest previously is no longer the highest. So those are some things you want to look at, like what is growing, what is decreasing, and you don't have to make theories about why that might be. You're just presenting the information. Another example would be maps. Sometimes there will be a map on the test. So this is a map of the city of Brantfield. City planners have decided to build a new shopping mall for the area, and two sites, S1 and S2, have been proposed. And again, they say summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So something like this, where you see a map and then you see a key, a little legend that's explaining to you what the different colors and the different symbols on the map mean. So you have a golf course, housing, estate, city center, industrial estate, some rivers, some roads, some railways. So you have to look at this and make sure that you understand it before you start to talk about it. And so you want to be talking about the different proposed sites and what is near those sites and what is around those sites. Another example would be a diagram. So the diagram will illustrate the process that is used to manufacture bricks for the building industry. You should summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So it almost always says that, but you still need to read it carefully to be sure that it says that. It could be slightly different at times. So you will see diagrams like this on the test sometimes. So you have to look, follow the arrows, see what the process looks like, what is first, what is second, what is third, and how you go from digging the clay all the way down through all the steps to delivery. So that is a process that you can explain. It's not just numbers on a chart, but it does also have some numbers. It has temperatures and it has numbers of hours for certain things. Another bar chart example is showing components of GDP in the UK from 1992 to 2000. And again, it says summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main features and make comparisons where relevant. So this is another bar chart, and we've already seen a bar chart, but they're very common, so you should be comfortable reading charts like this. Okay, so this task has a line graph and it also has a bar graph. So it tells you that you will be looking at the line graph showing visits to and from the UK, and the bar graph showing the most popular countries visited by UK residents in 1999. So you will be looking at the line chart, and you can read that it's millions listed along here and the years along the bottom, and then the legend that shows you what each line represents, each type of line. And then you'll also, in the same question, be using this chart, which shows you the different countries. So they list the different countries and then the number of millions of UK visitors. So you'll be using information from both of those. It's similar to in our earlier question when we had two pie charts. So you're still using information from two charts, just here visually they're in a different format. The next example has a pie chart and a bar chart. So the pie chart shows a percentage of persons arrested in the 5 years ending in 1994, and the bar chart shows the most recent reasons for the arrest. So the question is the same again, but always make sure that you're reading the question very thoroughly. So here we have the pie charts for males and females. Arrested and not arrested are the different colors in the chart. And then we have this chart, which shows the different reasons that they were arrested. So they have the reasons listed along the side here, and then females and males in your legend, and then numbers along here. So you'll be using both of those charts to give your answer. Some strategies for this section of the test are to take a little time to plan your essay before beginning. So don't just start immediately. You need to look at the charts and really understand your charts and then plan what you're going to say. Just take a minute to write out a brief overview of what you want to cover in each paragraph, or what are the main points that you want to focus on. Be sure that you paraphrase the question in your opening paragraph. So you are going to just give them information about what you're going to be covering, and have an overview of some of the main features of the chart in your opening paragraph as well. So those are some things you will want to do. Try not to be repetitive. It is common for students to sometimes use the same information more than once or many times. If they're lower level students especially, just be sure to focus on different pieces of information and not repeating one or two facts that you see there. There are always lots of different things that you can comment on. Be sure that you write some kind of concluding paragraph. Don't just stop in the middle of your thought and end it without wrapping up a little, but just a short thing to conclude. And leave time for proofreading at the end. Spelling counts. You can see a lot of mistakes when you read things over, so try not to use the full 20 minutes just for writing. Leave at least a couple of minutes at the end so that you can quickly go through and see if there are any obvious mistakes that you can fix. Some ways to prepare. You should be writing as much as possible and reading as much as possible, especially if you don't have someone to check your writing. So you're writing as much as you can maybe, but you're studying on your own. You don't have a tutor or a native English speaker to correct your work. Then it can be frustrating because you can't see your mistakes. So if you can have someone correct it for you and work with you, then that's ideal. But if you can't, or just to have more time working on things outside of your time with that person, you can be reading. So reading examples, sample questions from the IELTS writing section, that's really useful. You can find resources where you can be reading the question and some answers and the scores that they got, and also just reading in general. So reading can help you to see the way that people are forming their sentences. You can see how they're making complex sentences, and you can be taking note of those things. And maybe you'll see some types of phrases or linking words or descriptive words that you could use in your own writing. Of course, one of the biggest things to do is to practice reading graphs and charts. You need to be familiar with this. It's not something that everyone does in their everyday lives. So you need to make sure that you're reading as many as possible and making sure that you understand them. If you can't understand the graph or chart, then you can't really explain it to anyone. So that's a key step. Then you can learn some useful phrases for describing graphs. The vocabulary I mentioned today relates to that, but there is more that you can learn as well. Study useful words and phrases that you can use, not full sentences. You're not memorizing sentences, of course, because it will be different for each question that you have. But there are a lot of words and phrases that you can be more familiar with so that you can use them on the test. Read lots of sample questions and answers. That is key. That will make you feel really comfortable on the day of the test. You will not be surprised by their types of questions, and you'll feel like you've done this many times before. So read them and then, of course, practice them. So don't just read what you see on the internet and think that you're prepared, because actually forming the sentences yourself is a lot more difficult than just reading them. Same with speaking practice. It's easy to read something, but when you have to think quickly and put it in your own words, it becomes more difficult. So the number one thing to do is to practice as much as possible. So be sure that you are writing as much as you can, especially sample questions for the test. And that's all for task 1 of the writing section. of the IELTS test, and next time we will be doing part 2, which will focus mostly on task 2 of the writing section.